Across the 19th century, America kept digging up giants, not in one place, everywhere. A farmer sinking a well in Pennsylvania, a crew blasting a roadbed in Tennessee, quarrymen splitting limestone in upstate New York, and a pick striking something that rang wrong, something that wasn't stone. Again and again, in hundreds of local newspapers, the same impossible report ran in the same breathless ink. Bones too big for a human being. Thigh bones longer than a man's whole leg. Jaws that could fit over a living face like a mask. Skeletons laid out in the clay at 7 feet, 8 feet, 9. And every time, the story ended the same way. The bones were gathered up, crated, and sent off to the experts, to Washington, to the Smithsonian, for study, for safekeeping. And then, they were never seen again. The reports rhymed too, and that's what gave them their strange authority. A skeleton in one state would be described in nearly the same words as one 1,000 miles away, the same towering height, the same heavy brow, and again a detail that thrilled every reader. A double row of teeth, 2 full sets in a single jaw, the unmistakable mark, people said, of a breed of men that no longer walked the earth. When 100 strangers who've never met describe the same monster, it stops feeling like 100 lies and starts feeling like 100 witnesses. That feeling is exactly the trap. Notice the shape of every account, because the shape is the tell. The wonder is always specific, and the proof is always gone. The bones are measured to the inch, and then crated, shipped to some authority far away, and swallowed by silence. To a believer, a pattern that consistent reads like a fingerprint of suppression. To an investigator, it reads like something else, the signature of stories that can only survive as long as nobody is ever allowed to hold them. That last detail is the one that built an entire mythology, and it's the detail your title is reaching for. Somewhere under the New York quarries, the story goes, in the 1850s, men found something they were never meant to find. A report was written. It went up the chain to the people who decide what the public gets to know. And it came back down the way these things always come back down in the legend, sealed, returned unopened. A door quietly closed on a truth too big to let out. Here's what we're going to do with that story. We're going to take it seriously enough to follow it all the way to the bottom, because the bottom is far stranger and far more human than the legend lets on. There was no single sealed report under a New York quarry in 1856 that historians can point to. But there was a nation that wanted one. There were real bones, real quarries, real reports that really did vanish. And there was one New York giant pulled out of the ground in front of a crowd, written up in every paper in the country, that explains the whole phenomenon better than any conspiracy ever could. Because the question that matters isn't whether they found a giant under the quarry. The question is why an entire country, for the better part of a century, was so ready to believe they had. Why the proof always seemed to slip away just before anyone could examine it. And why, when the truth finally came out in the open, in daylight, in a courtroom, people kept paying to see the lie anyway. The giants were real in one sense only. They were real in the mind of the public, a public primed by its pulpits, its newspapers, and its own deep hunger to believe that the land it was busy conquering had once belonged to a vanished race of titans. To understand the report that came back unopened, you first have to understand the country that was waiting to open it. And what that country wanted, more than almost anything, was a giant. So before we get to the man who finally gave them one, we have to look at why they were so desperate to receive it. Open a Bible in 1850 America, and almost every household had one open. And in the 6th chapter of Genesis, you'll find a single haunting line. There were giants in the earth in those days. To a deeply religious public, that wasn't poetry. It was history. It was a promise that somewhere in the soil lay the bones of a literal race of giants, and that one day A spade would prove the scripture true. That hunger didn't live alone. It married a second story, just as powerful and far uglier, the myth of the mound builders. White America looked at the enormous ancient earthworks scattered across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys and refused to believe the ancestors of native peoples had built them. A lost race was a more comfortable answer. A vanished civilization of giants, or Israelites, or wandering Europeans. Anyone but the people being driven off that very land in the same decades. A giant in the ground didn't just confirm the Bible, it excused a conquest. Now add the newspapers. This was the golden age of what the era itself called humbug, the years when even respectable papers ran sensational discoveries with little more than a rumour behind them. A giant skeleton was circulation gold. It cost a country editor nothing to print a thrilling paragraph about bones unearthed 2 counties over, and by the time anyone went looking, the editor had sold his papers and moved on to the next marvel. And here's the part that's genuinely true, the kernel the legend grew around. Many of these finds really were sent to the Smithsonian, because the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology really did run a vast mound survey project, and really did ask people to ship in bones from ancient sites. So bones went to Washington by the crate, and most of them, being ordinary, were catalogued, shelved, and never heard about again, which to a believer looks identical to being buried on purpose. The institution at the centre of it all had a real name and a real mission. In 1879, the Smithsonian founded its Bureau of Ethnology, and under John Wesley Powell, it launched one of the largest archaeological efforts the country had ever mounted, sending field crews to open and measure the ancient earthworks. Part of that work was, bluntly, to settle the mound builder question with evidence, and the evidence pointed correctly to native ancestors, not to a lost race of titans. To a public invested in the giants, that conclusion didn't look like science. It looked like a verdict handed down by the very institution holding all the bones. That's the quiet engine under the whole conspiracy. An institution that collected bones, plus discoveries that were almost always misidentified or exaggerated, plus a public that wanted titans to be real. Stir those together, and you get a permanent suspicion that the experts in Washington are sitting on the truth. And the press kept the fire fed for decades. Well into the 1890s and beyond, papers as respectable sounding as any in the country ran dispatches about colossal skeletons hauled from mounds and gravel pits, almost always closing with the same tidy line, that the remains had been forwarded to the Smithsonian for examination. Repeat a sentence like that often enough, across enough towns and enough years, and it stops sounding like coincidence and starts sounding like a cover story. Nobody had to coordinate it. The formula coordinated itself. So what were people actually finding? Sometimes, nothing but a tall tale, but often something real and genuinely huge, just not human. North America had been home to mastodons and mammoths, elephants of the Ice Age, and their bones turn up in exactly the places these stories came from. River Marl, gravel pits, the very quarries and excavations where the giants were said to sleep. A mastodon thigh bone, pulled from the clay by a farmer who had never seen an elephant, looks for all the world like the leg of a colossal man. The mistake wasn't stupidity. It was the most natural error in the world, made by people with no framework to know better. It took until 1934 for the Smithsonian's own curator of physical anthropology, Alice Hrdlinka, to say the obvious out loud, that there had never been a race of 8-foot giants, and that the endless reports were the product of misidentified animal bones, and what he called, with real precision, the will to believe. The will to believe. Hold on to that phrase, because in the autumn of 1869, in a small New York town named Cardiff, one man was about to weaponize it. He had grown tired of arguing with the faithful about whether giants once walked the earth. So he stopped arguing, and he decided to build them one. His name was George Hull, and he was, by trade, a tobacconist from Binghamton, New York. By temperament, He was something rarer for his time and place, an outright skeptic, a man with no use for religion and a low opinion of people who had too much of it. The story of what he did begins with an argument. Hull was visiting family in Iowa when he fell into a heated dispute with a traveling Methodist minister over, of all things, that line in Genesis. Were there really giants in the earth in those days? The minister insisted, with total conviction, that there were. Hull thought the whole idea was nonsense, and he thought the man's certainty was worse than the idea. He lost the argument, not on logic, but on sheer crowd. And lying awake afterward, stewing, he had an idea that was equal parts revenge, experiment, and business plan. If people were this eager to believe in giants, he would give them a giant, and he would charge admission to watch them swallow it. What follows is one of the most patient cons in American history. In 1868, Hull went to Fort Dodge, Iowa, and had workmen quarry out an enormous block of gypsum, a soft, pale stone, more than 10 feet long. He told the quarrymen it was bound for Chicago to be carved into a monument to Abraham Lincoln, a story respectable enough to kill any curiosity. The block was shipped to a German stonecutter named Edward Burkhardt, and there, behind locked doors, 2 sculptors went to work, turning a slab of gypsum into a man. There was a grim cleverness even in the choice of stone. Gypsum is soft enough to carve quickly and cheaply, which kept the work fast and the circle of secret keepers small. It's also pale, with a faintly fleshy, bluish cast under certain light, unsettlingly close to the look of a real body. Hull was betting that people standing at the edge of a grave, primed to see a man, would see exactly what they'd come to see. But the same softness that made the giant easy to carve carried the flaw that would one day sink him. Gypsum dissolves in water, and Hull was about to bury his masterpiece in wet New York ground. The detail of that work is where you really see the mind behind it. They carved a giant lying on his back, 10 feet tall, his face calm, one hand resting on his abdomen as if he died in his sleep. To age him, they beat the surface with a mallet studded with needles, stippling the stone with tiny pits so it looked like weathered skin and pores. They scrubbed him with sand and water. Then they bathed the whole figure in sulfuric acid to stain and pit it, to give the gypsum the grey, gnawed look of something that had lain in the ground since before history. Then Hull shipped his giant east, to the farm of a relative named William Newell, near the village of Cardiff in central New York. On a November night in 1868, in the dark, they buried him behind the barn. And then George Hull did the hardest thing a con man ever has to do. He waited. A full year. He let the soil settle over the grave. He let the freshly turned earth go back to looking undisturbed. Let the seasons close the wound in the ground so that no one would ever guess it had been opened. He went home to his tobacco business and he sat on the secret, knowing that the longer he waited, the more convincing the lie became. Because the one thing his giant needed that he couldn't carve was time. None of this was cheap, and none of it was quick. Quarrying the block, shipping it hundreds of miles, paying sculptors to labour in secret, hauling a multi-ton statue across 2 states, and lowering it into a hole in the dark. Hull poured a small fortune, and the better part of 2 years into a joke, whose punchline he meant to charge admission for. That's the thing people forget about a great hoax. It isn't lazy. It takes more discipline than honesty ever would. By the autumn of 1869, the ground was ready. The giant had been sleeping under a New York field for a year, indistinguishable from a thing that had slept there for 1,000. All Hull needed now was a reason to dig, and a crowd to be watching when the shovel hit stone. On October 16th, 1869, William Newell hired 2 men to dig a well behind his barn. He pointed them with great care to a particular spot. A few feet down, one of their shovels struck something hard, and a foot, an enormous human foot in grey stone, rose up out of the New York clay. One of the diggers is said to have dropped his tools and shouted that some old Indian had been buried there. They cleared the dirt away and found the rest of him, 10 feet of serene, weathered giant, lying on his back in the bottom of the hole, as if he'd been waiting for them. Within a day, the news had outrun every wagon in the county. Newell threw up a tent over the pit and started charging admission, a quarter to look. Then, as the roads filled, 50 cents. They came by the hundreds, 300, 400, 500 people a day, rattling into a tiny farm village from across the state and then across the country. They stood at the edge of the hole and looked down at the giant, and many of them wept, or prayed, or fell silent, because they believed with all their hearts they were looking at proof. Here at last was the giant from Genesis. Here was the lost race, risen out of a New York field to settle every argument. And the experts, to their lasting embarrassment, did not all rush to call it a fraud. Some scholars hedged. A number of clergymen embraced it openly, preaching that the Cardiff Giant confirmed the literal truth of Scripture. The believers had waited a century for this, and now that it lay in front of them, grey and silent and 10 feet tall, they were in no mood to be told it was a tobacconist's gypsum. What made the giant so dangerous wasn't the carving, it was the timing. Hull hadn't invented the belief. He'd simply read it perfectly and cut a key to fit a lock the public had been carrying for 100 years. The crowds didn't pour into Cardiff because the statue was convincing. Up close, it wasn't especially. They poured in because it confirmed something they already ached to know. A lie that tells people what they already believe doesn't have to be good. It only has to arrive. But the cracks showed fast, because reality always leaves marks. The giant had been dropped into ground laced with running water, and gypsum dissolves in water. A genuinely ancient stone man in that wet New York soil would have been long gone. Then the scientists came. Othniel Marsh, the Yale paleontologist, climbed down, took one real look, and pronounced it a humbug of very recent origin. He could see the chisel marks, fresh tool marks that no object buried for centuries could possibly still wear. Andrew Dixon White, soon to lead Cornell, examined it and saw a sculpture, not a fossil. Money, meanwhile, did what money does. A syndicate of local businessmen, led by a man named David Hannum, bought a controlling share of the giant for a small fortune and moved it to Syracuse to charge even bigger crowds. And then the greatest showman of the age came calling. P.T. Barnum offered to buy it, was refused, and simply built his own copy, a fake of a fake, and exhibited it as the genuine Cardiff Giant. When Hannum heard that crowds were lining up to see Barnum's counterfeit, he's the one who supposedly grumbled the line history later pinned on Barnum himself. There's a sucker born every minute. He meant the people paying to see Barnum's copy. He did not seem to notice they were also paying to see his. The Barnum episode produced one last piece of perfect American comedy. Hannum's syndicate, furious that Barnum was profiting from a copy, hauled him into court to stop him. But how do you sue a man for exhibiting a fake of your giant when your giant is also a fake? The judge, by the accounts that come down to us, refused to help, telling the plaintiffs the law would protect their giant only if they brought it into court and swore it was genuine, which of course they could not. One fraud had no standing to complain that another fraud was copying it. The whole spectacle had begun to eat its own tail. 2 giants now, both fake, both packing the halls. A nation that had spent 100 years praying for a giant had finally gotten 2 of them at once, and not 1 ounce of either was real. It couldn't hold. George Hull had never meant it to. By December of 1869, with investigators sniffing at the gypsum and the trail leading back to Fort Dodge in Chicago, Hull sat down with the press and confessed the whole thing. The quarry, the Lincoln Monument lie, the sculptors, the needles, the acid, the year of waiting. In February of 1870, a court made it official. The Cardiff Giant was a statue. Both giants were. And here is the thing Hull said about why he'd done it, which matters more than the trick itself. He hadn't built the giant to make people believe. He'd built it to prove how easily they would, to hold up a mirror to a public so hungry for a particular truth that it would kneel at the edge of a hole and weep over a block of gypsum a man had soaked in acid the year before. Now go back to your title, to the report that came back from Washington, unopened. You can feel, can't you, exactly what that legend is offering. It's the comforting version. It says, the giant was real, and they found it, and powerful men sealed the truth away to keep us in the dark. That story lets the giant survive. It keeps the wonder intact and hands the disappointment to a villain. The documented truth is quieter and, in its way, far more unsettling. There was no sealed report under a New York quarry because there was no giant to write one about. The bones that vanished into the Smithsonian vanished because they were ordinary, or because they were mastodons, or because they were never quite as the newspapers swore. The evidence didn't disappear into a cover-up. It dissolved on contact with daylight, every single time, the way the Cardiff Giant would have dissolved in that wet ground if it had ever truly been old. It's worth being honest about what this does and doesn't prove. It doesn't prove every strange bone in American soil was a fraud. Plenty were honest mistakes, real fossils read by people with no training to tell an elephant from an ancestor. And it doesn't prove the Smithsonian never lost or mishandled a single specimen, because large institutions misplace things constantly. What it proves is narrower and sharper than that. The grand version, a hidden race, a deliberate silence, a sealed report, has never once produced the one thing it would need to be true. A giant that anyone, anywhere, can examine. Every road runs back to gypsum, or to a mastodon, or to a sentence in a newspaper that nobody bothered to check. There was a cover-up, but it wasn't run out of Washington. It was run, quietly and constantly, inside the mind of every person who needed the giant more than they needed the truth. The report came back unopened because they returned it unopened, because opening it meant reading a duller, harder fact than the one they'd already chosen to believe. The will to believe doesn't suppress evidence. It just declines to look. And the proof of that is still lying in a pit in New York, where you can go and stand over it today. The Cardiff Giant survived its own exposure. It was carted around for decades, and it ended up at the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown, where it rests in a shallow display pit, grey and serene, exactly as it lay behind Newell's barn. People still file past it. They know every detail of the hoax, the gypsum, the acid, the confession. They come anyway. They look down into the hole at the 10-foot man who never lived, and something in them still leans toward it, still half wishes. That's why the Cardiff Giant deserves to be remembered as more than a footnote in the history of humbug. In a strange way, it's the most honest artifact America ever buried. Every real giant skeleton report promised a truth and then withheld the proof. The giant did the opposite. It was a lie that, in the end, told the truth, about gullibility, about the press, about the will to believe, more plainly than any sermon or scientific paper of its century. George Hull set out to embarrass the faithful. What he actually left behind was a permanent monument to how badly all of us, believers or not, want the ground to be hiding something marvelous. That's the real discovery under the New York quarries. Not a giant. A hunger, the oldest one we have, for the world to be stranger and grander than the evidence allows, strong enough that we'll bury a comfortable lie a year in advance just to feel the thrill of digging it back up. The report on what they found was never returned unopened by some hand in Washington. We return it ourselves, every time the truth turns out smaller than the legend. We always have. And somewhere right now, someone is reading about a giant in the ground and choosing gladly not to open the envelope.